Buenas tardes. Entonces vamos a empezar esta tarde de conferencias con una sesión de historia de la biología y empezamos con la profesora Torrens, que va a dar una charla sobre el tema de Evolution and Secularism in Mexico.
Thank you, Gael. Thank you very much for your kind presentation. Can you hear me?
No.
Okay. Okay, well, before I begin, well, I would like to express my gratitude for your presence. I guess for many of us, this is the first in-person academic meeting after the pandemic. So it's something to be celebrated. I'm thrilled to be here. I also would like to acknowledge Doctors Ana Barahona, Carmen Martinez, Carlos Álvarez, Max Fernandez, and Jorge Martinez for having made this for Franco-Mexican advanced seminar in the history and philosophy of science possible. Thank you very much. I think we all appreciate very much your effort. I apologize in advance also for my out of practice English. Okay, so today I'm gonna talk about evolution and secularism in Mexico, and let me explain why. Okay, maybe you remember from past events that the issue of the teaching of evolutionary theory at different educational levels and the visual representation of evolution in educational materials have interested Dr. Barahona and myself for several years. So we are biologists, and evolution is the basis of modern biology. But from a historical point of view, evolutionary theory not only provoked an unprecedented revolution in the study of living beings, but also had an impact, as few scientific ideas have done, on culture. On the other hand, I recently became interested in the work of Londa Schillinger from the Stanford University regarding the study of the production of ignorance. And she states that we live in an age of ignorance, and she has devoted herself to understanding how this came to be and why, by exploring how ignorance is produced or maintained in diverse settings. So this idea of that a great deal of attention has been given to epistemology, the study of how we know, when how or why we don't know is often just as important, but remarkably under-theorized, arose my curiosity and my desire to contribute to agnotology, that is the study of ignorance making from the history of biology in the Mexican local context. Also knowing that since the end of the 19th century, in various nations with secularizing and democratic agendas, the subject of evolution was rapidly introduced into curricula. So we wanted, Dr. Barahona and myself, to know what was and still is the situation on the Mexican scenario in terms of the link between secularization and the teaching of such an important scientific subject. So we began a research into how and why the teaching of evolutionary theory has or has not come to be, or disappeared, or has been delayed or long neglected at various points in Mexican history. So what I will present next is some details of the theory of evolution, very briefly, followed by a commentary on secular education in the Mexican educational system. I will then give a historical overview of the challenges for the secular state and its educational institutions, and to finish with the current state of affairs and the importance of evolutionary theory in Mexican education. Well, I guess we all know Charles Darwin. Although Charles Darwin could be famous for having written more than 25 books or for having had 10 children with his cousin Emma, what he's world famous for is for having postulated the theory of evolution of species by means of natural selection. And before someone jumps here, it should be noted that although Darwin is acknowledged to be the most influential of the scientists who put forward the idea of biological evolution, he was by no means the first. But nevertheless, together with Alfred Russel Wallace, he can be considered the first to propose a consistent and complete mechanism to explain the transformation of species in his famous book published on November 24th of 1859, named On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. So even if we will not dwell too much on this book, it's interesting to mention that it was born out of a crisis, the history of which has been referred to many times, but I will tell it again very briefly. Okay, so for more than 2 years, Darwin meticulously, I'm sorry. No se puede quitarlo de arriba de la pantalla. Thank you. Yeah, that's better. Thank you, Marco. Okay, so for more than 2 years, Darwin meticulously wrote a lengthy manuscript that he planned to title Natural Selection. However, one morning in June 1858, he received a letter from naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace from an island in the Dutch East Indies, setting out in a short essay his ideas on evolution by a mechanism almost identical to natural selection. And this event prompted Darwin to write a summary described by himself as a long argument. As the world famous Darwin historian Janet Brown argues, what an argument. For few, and I quote, for few scientific texts have been so meticulously woven, so crammed with factual information, or so overflowing with imaginative metaphors. And because of the complexity of the themes woven into the origin and its author's ability to handle so many strands at once, Darwin's literary style has long been appreciated for its similarities to that of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. And Darwin undoubtedly crafted one of the most impressive and dense proposals of the 19th century. In summary, Darwin postulated that all species of living beings have evolved over time from a common ancestor through a slow and gradual process brought about by natural selection. And this explanation is based on 3 premises. The first is that the trait subject to selection must be inheritable. Also, there must be variability of the trait among individuals in a population. And this variability of the trait must result in differences in survival and reproductive rates. So the accumulation of these changes over generations would produce all the evolutionary phenomena, such as divergence of characters, adaptive radiation, speciations, and so forth. And although there is now a variety of research that has extended the evolutionary mechanisms, known as the extended synthesis, Darwin's contributions are undoubtedly still the basis of the explanation for the diversity of life. So now, moving from the content of the book to the public reactions, it is known that the publication of The Origin of Species sparked a debate that reached all sectors of Victorian society, mainly because the essence of Darwin's proposal was that living beings should not be regarded as works of the creator, but as fruit of entirely natural processes. So it is common knowledge that all copies of the first edition of On the Origin were sold out on the day of publication. So if someone is lucky enough to own one of the 1,250 copies, could earn nearly £200,000. That was the last auction in Christie's. Anyway, although it began in England, the reaction of scientists, theologians, philosophers, and even artists were not confined to Britain alone, but spread first to Europe, then to North America, and eventually to almost the entire planet. And as Janet Brown suggests, the debate provoked by the evolutionary theory was one of the first genuinely public scientific debates that cut across all strata of society. However, although Darwin's book was in direct opposition to the Genesis, well, the Genesis account of creation, the reality is that biblical fundamentalism is more a modern preoccupation of certain societies than it was a Victorian reality. At the time, more and more prominent men and women of the ruling class were skeptical or critical of the traditional doctrine of the Anglican Church, and dissenting and non-conformist groups were claiming the right to freedom of worship and even calling for the separation of church and state. Well, maybe for this reason, Darwin was never condemned or the focus of public scorn, and he died at the age of 73 and is buried with England's most illustrious personages in Westminster Abbey. Now, in the case of Mexico, the separation between civil and religious societies has been sustained since the promulgation of the Constitution of 1857 under the presidency of Benito Juárez, which established the first legal and regulatory basis for the separation of the state and the Catholic Church, with the primary purpose of counteracting the power and influence of the clergy in the civil life of a predominantly Catholic population. But it was not until after the Mexican Revolution in 1917 that it was established in the Mexican Constitution that education should be secular in both public and private schools, and so that no religious corporation could establish or direct primary schools. However, by then, several Western nations have given science, in particular evolutionary biology, a central place in the state education system, partly because of the conviction that science would be a secularizing force. Yet the theory of evolution remained absent from Mexican pedagogical materials until the implementation of the so-called socialist school. So this radicalization of Mexican education began in 1932 and is known as the socialist school, which gained strength during the presidency of General Lázaro Cárdenas from 1934 to 1940, who sought to establish a social and educational model with strong secularizing tendencies based on a rationalist view of the world. And it was really difficult defining what the socialist school would be. So it was thought that its meaning would become known and consolidated through reforms of programs, the selection of books, and changes in education systems, And this is how the subject of biological evolution finally found its way into textbooks, mainly because incorporating evolutionary thinking in the classroom was a way of underpinning the autonomy of education from religion and thus promoting a critical and rational spirit among the population. So during this time in Mexico, during the socialist education, there was a tremendous conceptual change in the teaching of natural sciences, which went from merely descriptive lessons on living beings to emphasizing that the most important thing to be taken into consideration, and I quote from the syllabus plan, the biological characteristics that mark in each group the admirable gradation involved in the evolution of living beings. So that the ideology behind the teaching of biological evolution in this period, so to contribute to the formation of a critical and scientific spirit in citizens that would encourage rationality over superstition and religious dogma, but the idea was that it would link education with mainly agricultural production and with the particular popular organization and social struggles. So in this local context, and well, I think it's interesting, well, it is important to know that the textbooks approved by the Ministry of Public Education during this period emphasize the possible applications of evolutionary theory by a global interest in including the theory in primary education. But in the particular Mexican context, in which the rural movement had significant political and social weight, the aim was to instruct students in crop management, domestication tools, and the importance of artificial selection in the agricultural production system. So this was to provide young Mexicans with the knowledge necessary for effective control and mastery of the environment through organized biological principles, and such as adaptation, the laws of adaptation, classification of local species, and the recognition of the economic and public health value. Unfortunately, the socialist educational project did not last long. Different social and political groups linked to conservative or religious views expressed their open opposition as they felt their interests threatened. And then the subject of evolution disappeared from later textbooks for several years. I really love this picture. So skipping a few decades, it was 1960 was the first year that all Mexican primary school children received universal content textbooks free of charge. 1 year after the founding by President Adolfo López Mateos, the National Commission for Free Textbooks. So finally, 14 years later, in 1974, the subject of biological evolution was included, albeit cursory, in the 6th grade textbooks. So here, it should be noted, however, that the study of the evolution of species was incorporated into primary school teaching more as the specific content of the syllabus than a systematic approach to the knowledge of living beings, which occurred in the reform of the primary education curriculum in the 1993 reform. This reform, the 1993, prompted the proposal not only to teach evolution as a topic, but also to develop the natural science syllabus in general with an evolutionary vision, which resulted in a fundamental transformation concerning the previous curriculum and textbooks that approached the knowledge of living beings from a merely descriptive point of view. And this change implied a great challenge for designing and elaborating the new national textbooks. And with much pride, I have to say that the author of these textbooks was Dr. Ana Barahona. Well, yeah, biological. Yeah. So yeah, thank you, Anna. Okay, so now moving to the current state of affairs and the importance of evolutionary theory in education. So finally, the 2009 educational reform, which is the last one, have not only the challenge of maintaining or better still surpassing the quality standards achieved in the current textbooks, but also the great challenge of overcoming the obstacles faced by the previous reform, especially, well, this is important, guaranteeing teachers training capable of developing an evolutionary mentality in students, so that 200 years after Charles Darwin's birth, his ideas, which revolutionized the way of understanding and explaining the natural world, would finally be disseminated and fully understood. But what happened? Okay, the textbooks in use today are result of Felipe Calderón's conservative government, do not contain the subject of human evolution. There is no chapter dedicated to it, not a single allusion to the origin of human beings. So since, in summary, since 1974, Mexican natural science textbooks have changed only 3 times. This corresponding to the 3 major educational reforms, the one in 1970, the one in 1993, and the one in 2009. And as for the topic of evolution, the number of pages, which maybe can give an idea of the attention given to the topic. So the number of pages devoted to its exposition is most significant in those from 1993, with 34 pages, followed by the one of 74 with 22 pages, and surprisingly, the 2009 book, which is still in use today, deals with the subject in only 14 pages with unclear and even erroneous concepts. For example, speaking of fossils, they say they are conceived only as evidence of life in the Earth's past, which may be a view that corresponds more to thinkers such as Cuvier than to evolutionists such as Darwin. Just to make some concluding remarks and to maybe make you appreciate the extent of the problem in Mexico, and I like to say that this universal character of the free textbooks makes them a genuinely influential element in the education of Mexican children and youth. Some 2.7 million copies of each title are currently published each year. And for example, suppose one considers that a book has been issued for the last 14 years, such as the case of natural sciences for the 3rd grade of primary. So that means that it has been used by 37.8 million Mexican children, equivalent to 35% of the current population. So in that case, we can understand the significant impact of the various decisions underlying these textbooks on Mexican education, idiosyncrasy, and ideology, since textbooks are not neutral repositories of knowledge, but political. And also, this is really interesting. Currently, according to the recent National Survey on Religion, Secularization, and Secularism by the Institute for Legal Research of the UNAM, 73% of Mexicans affirm that life was created by a supreme being called God. Furthermore, 47% consider that creationism should be taught in schools, and only 30% thought schools should teach the evolutionist thesis. Moreover, of those who did subscribe to the theory of evolution, 48% said they were convinced that a supreme being guided evolution. In comparison, 32.7% responded that biological evolution is due to natural processes, such as the natural selection of species. So this shows the still latent challenge of scientific literacy in Mexican society. So the subject of evolution has generated controversy and polarization in various sectors of society worldwide, and mainly because it goes against the belief in a divine or supernatural origin of species. And as the renowned paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould said, well, Darwin dealt a severe blow to human egocentrism. So although evolution and its teaching are at the center of constant tension with dogmas and religions, it is not the only theme. Think of the education of human sexuality or assisted reproduction techniques, gene editing, and all the ethical discussions they trigger, among others. And so with this one, I will conclude. So this is why today, in an era of mass disinformation and the production of ignorance, fostered by the omnipresence of the internet and social networks, and promoted by anti-science movements, it is even more urgent to defend scientific literacy and the commitment to scientific thinking based on empirical knowledge. And hopefully, basic education curriculum in Mexico will soon be modified again. So I guess now there's a new reform, right? And the evolutionary theory will once again be considered the central axis of all biological knowledge in all years of primary schools. Churches have, with no doubt, the right to freedom of expression within democratic and liberal institutions. They have complete freedom to define religious guidelines and prescriptions for the faithful who accept them voluntarily. But we must defend and promote secularism in education and give greater weight to the scientific understanding of the origin of the species and the human being than to the religious justification of the creation of life. And well, that's it for my participation. Merci. Gracias. So I think we have 10 minutes for questions.
Muchas gracias. Interesante. Creo que la cuestión de la cosmología es muy importante. Mi pregunta es sobre antes de la revolución. O sea, ¿qué tipo de discusión hubo sobre el darwinismo en esa época? Que había un movimiento, como decir, científico bastante importante que trató de producir una educación pública, la preparatoria. Entonces, ¿cómo se habló? Se trató de introducir a Darwin en la enseñanza secundaria, por ejemplo. Y la otra pregunta es, usted nos habló de Darwin, pero en esa época había también Lamarck, Spencer, y Spencer especialmente tenía aspectos políticos a la vez. ¿Y cómo se mezcló todo eso?
¿Puedo contestar en español o está bien por lo demás? Ok, sí, aquí hay varios asuntos. Muchas gracias por su pregunta. México, bueno, la primera persona que introdujo las ideas de Darwin fue Justo Sierra en 1875. Efectivamente, había todos estos evolucionismos de los cuales Juan Manuel nos ha hablado en varias ocasiones. Es un error pensar que solamente no estaba el evolucionismo de Darwin. Sin embargo, a nosotros nos ha interesado la introducción de las ideas evolutivas en la enseñanza básica. Entonces fue Justo Sierra quien introduce estas ideas por ser quien traduce el libro de la versión en francés. y escribe libros sobre todo para nivel universitario, los cuales sí incluían las teorías evolutivas de Darwin y otros. Después la cosa es que en México realmente, a pesar de que Benito Juárez, que bueno, es de 1800, bueno, ya vimos, ¿no? 57, que lucha por este Estado laico. Él quería una separación definitiva de Estado e Iglesia y también pensaba, junto incluso con Lerdo de Tejada después y Porfirio Díaz, que la educación era como la vía para lograr la democratización del pueblo y bueno, la información. Sin embargo, bueno, ¿cómo entendieron la laicidad? O sea, en este caso, bueno, la secularización fue distinta. Y de hecho, en realidad por eso se me había ocurrido primero el tema, porque este seminario es cambio conceptual. Entonces, también estaba pensando, pues sí, el cambio conceptual de la laicidad, cómo se ha entendido y manejado en los diferentes momentos históricos. Por ejemplo, Porfirio Díaz fue mucho más laxo que Benito Juárez en cuanto a la laicidad, porque tuvo que hacer distintas alianzas. Pero bueno, la cosa para introducir el tema de la evolución fue que realmente no se le prestó atención al libro de texto de enseñanza básica hasta la era posrevolucionaria. La SEP fue creada en 1921, pero bueno, aún así, pues es algo que siempre se ha discutido, cuáles son los temas que tienen que llevar los libros. Y México, de hecho, desde siempre se ha como establecido que no tenemos una cultura evolutiva, ni siquiera en la actualidad. Hay un artículo del doctor Daniel Piñero que, utilizando los proyectos de CONACYT y las publicaciones, puede ver que todavía somos un país más interesado en la clasificación y la parte de como establecimiento de los recursos naturales con fines más explotables, ¿no? Que realmente con una visión evolutiva que ya existe, pero es bastante reciente. Y no sé si contesté a su pregunta.
Spencer.
Ah, Spencer, ¿si llegó a México? ¿O cuál fue la? No sé. Eso es el experto, es Juan Manuel, ¿me ayuda?
I can say something about it. Spencer, in fact, this university was founded under Spencerian principles. Justo Sierra was an Spencerian in that fact. So Spencer was read, especially the National Preparatory School here at Union. All these evolutionists of the mid-19th century in Mexico were a combination of Spencerian positivists, and with some elements of Darwin, but especially elements provided by Haeckel. That in that sense provide some elements from the original Darwin, as you can say, but also some elements from Lamarckism also. So the evolutionary view that you can find in Mexico at that time, it was like a mixture of all these schools of thought in that sense. But Spencer maybe was one of the most important for all these naturalists and philosophers in Mexico. Just to say something.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question here.
C'est un commentaire, je te demande un commentaire. Le commentaire sur
Non, non, je ne parlais pas français.
The first comment is that we have, for the first time in this Mexico president that says publicly this created. So I'm really worried with the president initiatives activities to create this government. So it's quite worrisome. Quite worrisome. So you are very optimistic that we have a functioning parliament.
I'm not optimistic, I'm really afraid.
And the other thing is very interesting, when you mentioned this statistic, those who subscribe the theory of evolution, 48% say they are convinced there is a supreme being. You know, Wilson died recently, and in an interview before his death, he said that you cannot deny that there is something. I was astonished. Climate scientists, evolutionary scientists, think that. So, are you optimistic or what?
I have no comment. I don't know. Thank you, Jorge. Yeah, I should say that.
We have time for the last short question. Is there a question? Okay, so thank you, Erika.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
That's
Our next speaker is Juan Manuel Rodríguez Caso, professor in la UNAM. So he's going to talk about the Darwinian origin of anarchism, how the British intelligentsia shaped the laws of participation.
It's everyone who will be here. Thank you very much to the organizers of this meeting. Again, I'm really happy to be here. Well, as is already mentioned, what I'm going to speak is about this maybe a very controversial idea, that is the Darwinian origin of Lamarckism. I have to say, this is not an original idea. This is not my idea. As I will show, this idea was first claimed by a French historian, and after some research, I have to agree a lot with him in that sense, that I'm going to present some of the elements that I already found, especially when looking at the publications, especially some books, papers, the newspapers at the different times, in which I really think that there are a lot of evidence that Lamarckism in the end, it was a British invention, a Darwinian invention in that sense. Well, this is a very brief summary. Maybe it looks a lot, but it's not that much. First of all, I'm going to speak about what I found when reading this French historian, that maybe some of you know him very well. You knew him very well. Juan. I'm sorry, my French maybe is not the best. Juan. No. So my French is awful. Sorry for that.
It's
Oh my God. Okay. Thank you. When looking at a very interesting dictionary of history and philosophy of science, under the entry of Lamarckism, he claims that Lamarckism has this origin After reading a lot in these last months, I found that he was right in that sense. And it makes a lot of sense that, at least in my case, I'm interested in the Victorian science mainly. I need to read much more French history. That's for sure. I need to read much more French history in that sense. After that, what I'm going to present is a very brief discussions about how Lamarck were discussed in Britain, especially at the beginning of the 19th century, especially in Edinburgh, that was the place with London also, where Lamarck was received in some way at the beginning. And after that, I'm going to speak about Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, the geologist, was maybe the main promoter of Lamarck's ideas in Britain. And there is a very good reason for that. He was really scared of Lamarck's ideas. But at the same time, he promoted these ideas, especially among all the British academia, the British intelligentsia in that sense. And this was very influential for many years. I think that this is something important to be noted. Also, the role of Darwin as a possible interpreter of Lamarckism or something like that. I think that this is a very heated discussion about the role of Lamarckian mechanisms in Darwin in that sense, but I think that it's quite important to recuperate in some way what Darwin said in relation with Lamarck in that sense. And I want to speak also about very briefly the role of the co-discoverer of the theory of natural selection of Russell Wallace. In his role of popularizer of Darwinism, he was also a popularizer of Lamarckism. That's something that maybe was not his intention when speaking about Darwinism in that sense. But he, at the same time, he was speaking all the time about Lamarck. Maybe that's one of the main points to be stressed in order to show how at some point, I'm going to show the charts now, especially in the late 1880s, Lamarckism began to appear a lot in the writings in English, especially in Britain. And just by the end, I'm just going to mention some of the authors and writings that, especially all of them, belong to this group that we can characterize as the Darwinian group, especially people such as Henry Huxley and all the other people involved in the X Club and some other scientific groups related with, that they had a lot of interest in discussing that Lamarck all the time. That's very strange. Maybe they don't agree with him or with his ideas, but they were all the time discussing Lamarck's ideas. And then some final things. Yes. Okay. Here is the quote that I prefer to present in French. This is the beginning of this entry about Lamarckism in the dictionary, d'Histoire de l'Expédition. And I think that it's quite powerful what he said, because in the end, it was for me the first time that I heard this idea about Lamarckism and a British dimension, or something like that. But the one present in the entry is a historiographical description of how it's different if you read the British authors on the one side, or you read the French authors on the other, and how there are a lot of difference in how they are describing Lamarck's ideas, especially in the 19th century, but also in the 20th century. And in that sense, one of the differences is maybe you can find in the historiographical French tradition, Lamarck is a much more positive claim in general that you can find. But in the British tradition, Lamarck is like the bad guy all the time. He's like the one who was wrong, he doesn't have any reason, etc. Also, when speaking, that's also what Moran mentions in the entry, when speaking in French, at least, about Lamarckism, is to claim about the origin of the doctrine of the transformism. Especially Lamarck is recognized in that sense as the first coherent author who is going to present a theory of transformism in this case, not evolution necessarily. But it's very important to note that in some other traditions, the British one, Lamarck is many times not recognized in that sense. All the time is Darwin the third one. I don't agree at all with that idea because more like a Wallace one in some way. And Wallace has also a role in this in history. Okay, just taking some advantage of this chart that you can find with Google, especially with all the databases about Google Books. You can look, for example, this application, Engram Viewer. You can take some notes about any particular work, and you can look how it is going to appear through time in that sense. I'm just showing here what is the 19th century. I'm just going to show you 4 charts, 2 in English, 2 in French, just to show the difference, maybe not that much in many cases, about how Lamarckism on one side and Darwinism on the other one were developed as a terms, as a concept in books. This is just 4 books. Maybe we need to do this also for papers, newspapers at some point. But at least in considering books, as you can see, it's going to be around the mid-1880s when Lamarckism is going to begin to appear a lot in books. After that, it's going to be discussed, maybe not that much, as I could show. There are some authors that are going to be discussed in Lamarck at that time, but it's going to be here around the 1880s when the interest in Lamarck in Britain, in English, is going to grow a lot in that sense. This is the same period for Darwinism in English, and you can see here it's from basically publication of the original species around 1859, 1860, mid-1860 something, when Darwinism is going to grow and is going to maintain the interest even to the late 19th century in that sense. Engram Viewer provides different results depending on the capitalization of the word. If you only use, sorry, English, that's not even capitalization, that's all. In that sense, you can also put the chart with just one kind of capitalization and it's a little bit different. I prefer here to show the 3 different capitalizations in order to show how different it is, because in the language is also important in that sense. You know, in English it's more common to find this kind of expression. In French, it seems that it's much more common. This one, for example, is just to give a general view in that sense. Okay, this is Darwinism in French. You can also see that it's from the 1860s, more or less. The first French translation of Darwin is from 1862, as I remember. So this is more or less the point when Darwinism is going to be discussed in French. And well, about the early discussions of Lamarck in Britain. There are some evidences that you can find references to Lamarck before 1826, but especially if you look at the work of authors such as James Clifford and John Desmond, more recently Bill Jenkins, it's agreed at some point that is 1826 when with this paper of the changes which life has experienced on the globe, published in the Edinburgh Medical Journal, is going to be the first formal statement about Lamarck, especially in relation with his transformist view, because maybe there were some other claims before about Lamarck in relation with political issues. It was Robert Jameson, who is considered the first Lamarckian in Britain at that point. I have to stress this idea. The first discussion of Lamarck in Britain were confined to politics, especially to the radical groups, especially the physicians, the British physicians who went to taught in France, then returned to England at some point and who knew all the works, not just from Lamarck, but also from Juan and some others. And they discussed mainly Lamarck in the political arena. This one is maybe the first discussion about Lamarck in the biological and natural history. And for example, well, this is maybe, I think, the most important moment for me at least, in the sense of how Lamarck was presented to the general public and the scientific public especially. Charles Darwin, Charles Darwin, maybe one of the most important scientists of the Victorian era, devoted at least 4 chapters in his main book, Principles of Geology, in order to criticize the ideas of Lamarck, the transformist ideas of Lamarck. Basically, Lyell was extremely afraid that these ideas would reach the general public or even the general academia, because at least Lyell was a profoundly religious person, was quite worried about the consequences of the materialist interpretation of Lamarck's ideas. So in that sense, he was quite harsh in his critics to Lamarck. He tried to show how bad it can be to consider these ideas to explain basically everything. And this one, Lyell's interpretation was the one who was promoted basically among all the British authors during the 19th century, especially if they can read French, if they can read French, they can read Lamarck there directly. But if not, most of the authors, that includes Darwin, Wallace, and some others, basically read Lamarck in Lyell's book. And that's something that has to be considered, because in that sense, the misinterpretations about Lamarck began to be raised in some of the discussions. I have to be clear in that sense. The first English translation of Lamarck's book is from 1914. So it took more than 100 years to appear this translation, a full translation of Lamarck's in English. And in all that time was Lyell the reference in order to speak about Lamarck. And that's something that maybe is something strange to be considered here. This is quote from this letter that Lyell sent to Darwin on March 15, 1863. And this is just like a curiosity, because in the end, maybe Lyell was a very harsh critic of Lamarck, but Lyell in the end was an evolutionist. Lyell all the time considered himself as an evolutionist, but not in the public arena, just in private. These letters, sent obviously to Darwin in private, they show how worried was Lyell at some point about the interpretation he provided of Lamarck. Maybe he considered that he was not necessarily killed. He said, I felt I had done him injustice. He was not quite fair with Lamarck's ideas in that sense. Because in the end, Lyell shared most of the ideas provided in that sense by Lamarck, for example. He was an evolutionist, a closet evolutionist. That's a correct expression. Okay, Darwin. Again, I quote here Juan, who says that the development of Lamarckism is going to be considered in parallel way to Darwinism. When people was speaking about Darwinism, at the same time they were speaking about Lamarckism. And in that sense, the role of Darwin has not to be overstated. In the end, Darwin included some of these discussions in his main books, such as The Origin of the Species or The Descent of Man. He has some kind of commitment with this Lamarckian mechanism. Maybe he was more interested in the natural selection more at some point. He also included these mechanisms. As I said at the beginning, I know that is a very heated debate, that maybe it's too much to say that Darwin was also a Martian, maybe that's too much to say, but Darwin was quite aware of the importance at some point of these mechanisms in order to explain some of the biological phenomena that he was not able to explain through natural selection, for example. And maybe we consider that many people who read Darwin's books, maybe in that sense, they also knew a lot about Lamarck's ideas in that sense. Now, Wallace is a very well-known figure, especially as a popularizer, as a defender of Darwinism, especially from the 1880s, especially one of his main books, Darwinism, made in 1889. Is where Wallace is going to present all these ideas related to Darwin, but at the same time is going to present some of the critics Wallace, in that sense, present with Lamarckism in that sense. And he was not just in this book, but he also in a lot of reviews he wrote during these years, the 1880s, the 1890s, even in the beginning of the 20th century. He was discussing a lot about the role of Lamarckism when discussing Darwin's ideas, for example. Especially, he was quite aware of relating these two ideas, used and misused, and further traits to the idea of Lamarckism. Those two ideas are the main concepts that are going to be related with Lamarckism in the end, in all the discussions that are going to happen by the end of the 19th century, even at the beginning of the 20th century, about all the British authors at the time. This is one that I mentioned already about the first English translation of the philosophy theology, that is from 1914. And again, all this time, all these authors, Darwin and many others, relate to Lyell in order to know about Lamarck. And that's something not to be missed in order to for the discussion. This is your one example. Again, you can see for the dates, 1888, 1889, 1891, etc. By the end of the 19th century, we're going to find a lot of these examples. Most of them, as you can see, are in Nature. Nature is going to be a journal quite interested in promoting scientific ideas, but especially Darwinian ones, because in the end, the Darwinian circle was in charge of Nature, and they took advantage in that sense of the journal to present all these ideas and discussions. And as you can see, there are also about the conflict between Lamarckism and Darwinism. A lot of discussions in that sense from these authors such as George Romanes, Madola, Lancaster, who was a student from Huxley, for example, Hockerell, Henslow, etc. I have to say, these discussions promote different views about what Lamarck said. This is not, in many cases, there were not the same discussions that they were promoting, because also Darwinism, it was not understood in the same way. Both Darwinism and Lamarckism were understood in different ways. And that's something that they have to be really clear in that sense, because there is some kind of tendency in history of science to assume that some concept has one particular meaning or something that is, you can find it there all the time in different authors or something. And in that sense, here you can find different interpretations of both Darwinism and Lamarckism in that sense. And well, this is just some final remarks and ideas that I want to present, some of them I already mentioned. According to Laurent's approach, until the 1880s, when you are going to find all discussions about Lamarckism, there are some mentions around the 19th century, but the big importance of Lamarck is going to be shown until the end, especially in these kind of discussions, like I already showed, especially in journals such as Nature, for example, but also books, newspapers, etc., etc. I think, at least for me, it's clear that there is a parallelism between the development on the one side of Darwinism and on the other one of Lamarckism is going to be promoted in a similar way in that sense. Well, the recognition of Lamarck's ideas, I think that we need to look more Lyell in that sense. Lyell is a very overestimated scientist during the Victorian era, who was quite influential, not just in the political arena, also in the scientific arena in general. And this kind of example that promote this view that with my idea. And again, I'm going to tell you again, I need to read more French history. I need it because this is something that I need in order to complement this view, because at the end, this is the view that you can find in British history or Anglo-Saxon history, if you prefer. But certainly, when I look at this entry from Juan, it was quite interesting to find other view that I didn't know. And I think that it has been quite important to know more about it, and especially in the relation of disciplines such as biology in general, development of biology, because in the end, we are in some way slaves of this idea of the Darwinian revolution. Maybe it's not maybe the idea to move to the Lamarckian revolution, maybe not that, but to have a more inclusive view of the history of science and biology in that sense. And I finish with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
In English.
Thank you very much. We appreciate such precise historical studies. Very, very good. Thank you very much. My question is marginal because I'm a specialist in Wallace. And I was seeing the writing of Wallace in Lamarckism. And what I'm speaking tomorrow is Wallace was an exception in Darwin concerning human origin. Do you think Lamarckism has had something to do with Wallace's exception for humans?
No. The short answer is no. No, Wallace rejected, at least in his view about the general theory of evolution he defended in, for example, in books like Darwinism, he rejected Lamarckism. And in that sense, the rejection, we can discuss this more, obviously. I think that there are many elements that has to be considered in Wallace's view in order to understand why he rejected this integral view of natural selection in order to explain the human mind and the human cognitive capacities, etc. But Lamarckism was not one of them, that's for sure. There are some other elements that I'm going to discuss more.
Thank you. Is there another question?
Thank you for your talk, Manuel. It was really interesting and really clear. So, do you think that when people say Darwin has some Lamarckist ideas or even mechanisms, they are only focusing on what Darwin said about human evolution, or do you think Darwin used Lamarckist ideas for the rest of the species and animal and plants and so on?
Darwin used Lamarckian mechanisms not just to explain human beings, but also the rest of nature. I think, especially in the origin of the species, there are some examples in relation with plants, so remember. Maybe we need to look more, for example, from some more examples in the origin of the species in particular, because there are this discussion about that in the origin of the species, the example of human beings it's not confirmed. You can relate, but it's not considered itself in the book. Darwin devoted another book to this idea of human beings, of the set of man, in which he is going to recall again on some of the Lamarckian mechanisms to explain some behavioral traits, especially as I remember, when speaking about sexual selection and some other stuff like that, in order to apply Lamarckian mechanisms to human beings. But as I know, Darwin used these Lamarckian examples to explain not just human beings, but also.
Is there another question? Thank you very much for your talk. My question was more like a remark, a kind of curiosity. The question is, if there are the same kind of relationship between Hegelianism and Darwinism in Germany, or German-like countries at this time. I mean, because as far as I know, the difference, the conceptual differences between Darwin and Hegel are not very clear at that time, especially in Germany, since Hegel introduced Darwin there. So my question was, I know also that Darwin was very enthusiastic with Hegel. So since Lamarck is a kind of figure pour tout soi, you know, by contrast, why and how, which kind of relationships are between Hegel and Darwin comparing to Lamarck and Darwin?
Okay, let me see if I understand what the question. Okay. What I understand is that Hegel, in the end, is considered to be the main promoter of Darwinism in Europe, continental Europe at least. And in that sense, he promoted a very particular view of Darwin's ideas. Well, even the title of his main book was The History of Natural Creation. It was not the origin of the species or something in German. He changed, he interpreted very freely some of Darwin's ideas in that sense. And in that sense, what I know is that the Hegelian view of evolution promoted not just on one side of selection, but also Lamarck's views were part of the same explanation. They were not like evolution is much more important than Lamarckian mechanisms. No, it was something more integrated view, as I think. In that sense, it helped to promote, I think, this view that is much more the original Darwin, I can say, because in the end, Darwin was discussing these ideas, than the interpretation that was promoted, especially later, especially in Britain, but also in the 20th century by some other people who were, I think, in Ernst Mayr particularly, who was very aware of the idea that Darwin is equal to natural selection period. That's all. I think that a more historical view is this idea of understanding that Hegel, in some way, was promoting a view closer to the original Darwin's view than other authors, I think. I don't know if I'm answering.
Yeah, that's the point, because my thought is, I think a bit strange the fact that Lamarck is a kind of tool for reinforcing the Darwinian position, and Hegel Darwin was very enthusiastic with Hegel, so, but he could have been used Hegel as with the same treatment he used Lamarck. And so, and in addition, if we consider that Hegel sometimes mixed between Lamarck and Darwin, it's in addition more summarizing the fact that Darwin didn't push away Hegel the same way he pushed away Lamarck.
I'm not entirely sure it was Darwin the one who was pushing against Hegel. At least in my view, well, I don't know, well, maybe, I don't know, I just just thinking that all these Darwinian circles, especially all these people like Huxley and some others, were the ones who were promoting this idea of Darwin's ideas just in relation with natural selection instead of some other mechanisms. Because at least in the discussions, some of them, again, I was thinking Huxley, he considered himself like a promoter of Darwin's ideas, the main promoter. In that sense, he took some liberties, I think, in order to defend a very particular view of him, maybe not the view from Darwin in that sense. But I maybe need to read more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any question? No, I have a very small one. Yeah, we have that. So you said that at the end of the 19th century, Darwinism and Lamarckism didn't have the same meaning as today, for example. And listening to you, I'm not so surprised now that promote the integration of X and identity in evolutionary theory. Said that the return of Lamarckism or success of Lamarckism against Darwinism, and here Lamarckism is mainly non-random variation, and Darwinism is a random variation. So I was wondering if you could say just one or two meanings of Darwinism and Lamarckism at the end of the 19th, maybe one at the end of the 19th century.
Well, I have to say, less than 2 weeks ago, I presented a talk about the different meanings of Darwinism here at the University Seminar of History and Philosophy, Science and Medicine. And it was quite strange for me to find that you can find the definitions like from people like us, for example, defining Darwinism is evolution by natural selection, period. But you can find some other definitions by people such as George Henslow, who was the son of John Henslow, the one who promoted Darwin to the people, etc., who said that Darwinism was evolution by the influence of the environment. And that's in 1907, for example. And there are some other discussions of these authors, and there is not like an agreement in the sense just to defend Darwinism exclusively on the idea of natural selection. There are some others that are more inclusive, if you want, like Henslow in this case. There are some others who are promoting materialistic explanations, like, for example, there are some others who are promoting idealist explanations with Darwin as the basis, etc. I think that Darwinism has very different meanings in the historical sense. Lamarckism, I think that is something similar in that sense.
Thank you very much.